Many thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this week's video. For years, I thought I was exposing my photos correctly, but I was actually ruining them the entire time. See, every shot looked great on the back of my camera, but when I got home, they were always way too dark. It turns out I was making one huge mistake that's actually super common, and I'm going to show you why it destroys your exposure, plus exactly how to fix it. I used to be focused on preserving so much detail in the sky that I would completely ignore the rest of my exposure. But once I learned these 3 simple tips, everything changed for me. And be sure to stick around because I'll share a bonus tip at the end that helps me get a perfect exposure every single time. See, I used to take a shot, check the back of my camera, and if the sky looked too bright, I'd reduce my exposure to bring back the detail, thinking I was doing the right thing. After all, blown out highlights are bad, right? But here's the problem. Your camera screen is backlit and doesn't show the real exposure. It just makes everything look brighter. See, when I darken my photos to make the sky look better on my LCD, and since the sky is usually the brightest part of a scene, I was actually severely underexposing everything else without even realizing it. So what's the real problem with this, and how do you fix it? There are 3 ways to guarantee a perfect exposure, even when your camera screen is completely lying to you. And I've ranked them in order of importance, with the bonus tip being by far the best approach. So let's jump right into it. First, there's a bit of a workaround to this one, so stick with me. But stop trusting your eyes and LCD and start relying on your camera's exposure compensation. This lets you override your camera's guesswork and brighten the image in small increments without having to change any of the other settings, aperture or shutter speed or anything like that. So if your shots are too dark, you can dial up exposure compensation a bit, plus 0.3 or plus 0.7 stops. This is an easy and a very effective way to bring up or reduce exposure in small increments. But the problem with exposure compensation is that you have to be shooting in some type of an automatic mode in order to enable it. So if you're a fully manual shooter like I am, you will not have access to exposure compensation. But here is the workaround. So a lot of photographers, they want to have control over aperture and shutter speed at the same exact time. They don't want to use shutter priority and they don't want to use aperture priority because they want to have control over both. Here's the workaround. If you put your camera in manual mode, now you have control over your aperture. You also have control over your shutter speed. And then enable auto ISO. This is the auto component that's going to give you access to exposure compensation. So having your camera in fully manual mode, enable auto ISO, you control aperture, you control shutter speed, your camera will take care of the ISO, and then you will have access to exposure compensation. Exposure compensation is fantastic as we just went through, but that is a really good workaround that's going to give you the ability to control everything and still use exposure compensation, outside of course ISO. And you can set the ISO level. So you can set a minimum floor, you can set a maximum floor. And I made an entire video all about the power of auto ISO, which I'll link above here if you want to take a look at that. Next, don't ignore your camera's built-in light meter. It's the little scale in your viewfinder that tells you if your image is properly exposed. So if your meter is too far to the left, your photo is underexposed. If it's too far to the right, it's overexposed. So you want to bring it closer to 0 for a more balanced exposure. I used to completely ignore this, but once I started checking it before every shot, my exposures instantly improved. It's one of those things that in most cameras, you always see it in the viewfinder. You also almost always see it on the back of your LCD, but it is so often overlooked. And it is probably one of the quickest ways to see if your exposure is underexposed, overexposed, or properly exposed. Now, you don't have to nail it right at 0 every single time, but it kind of gives you a baseline. Generally speaking, you want to be somewhere around 0, whether that's 1 stop under, no, I wouldn't even say that, maybe a half stop under 0 to a full stop over 0, depending on the scenario. But you want to try and keep that light meter always kind of hovering right around 0. That's going to be a good best practice for you in order to get a great exposure every single time. Finally, it's time to start trusting the histogram. If the graph is stacked to the left, your image is too dark. If it's pushed to the far to the right, you're gonna lose highlight details. Instead of guessing, using the histogram to make sure your exposure is balanced is by far probably the best way to go. I used to think a histogram was very complicated, kind of nerdy, but once you get the hang of it, they tell you exactly, or it tells you exactly whether your exposure is correct. And this is a good example right here. So as you can see, this is where the histogram is right now. Let me actually just reset this to the complete raw file. Here it is. And this is the way that I photographed. And as you can see, it's piled up right in the center. So it looks like a balanced exposure. So if your histogram is looking more like this right here, as you can see, the image is definitely going to be far too bright. If your histogram is looking more like this right here, you'll be able to tell that your histogram is, or your image is going to be far too dark. So you should be able to look at your histogram and within a split second, be able to tell if your image is underexposed, overexposed, or properly exposed. I used to get kind of fixated on the ideas like, what are the shadows look like? What do the midtones look like? What do the brighter midtones look like? The white point, the black point, highlights. You don't really have to pay that much attention to it when you're just looking at a histogram for exposure readings. You can just look, is it piled to the left? If it is, it's underexposed. If the majority of it is all to the right, then it's overexposed. You kind of want to get it all generally in the center of your photograph, or the center of the histogram, like this right here. So underexposed, overexposed, generally right around here, it's going to be a good exposure. Now, here is that bonus tip I promised. It's exposing to the right, or ETTR. This is an absolute game changer if you shoot in a RAW format. Exposing to the right basically means you're brightening your exposure slightly, pushing the histogram closer to the right without clipping the highlights. This gives you more shadow detail, less noise, more dynamic range, better colors, I should say better color accuracy, and superior image quality when you edit. So when I started to use exposing to the right for my RAW files, I had so much more detail and most importantly, so much more editing flexibility in the digital darkroom. This is an amazing example of it. This is a completely raw file with no editing adjustments to it whatsoever. And as you can see, the histogram is definitely pushed over to the right. I have the clipping indicators on, and I just want to show you this. If I come over here to the exposure slider and I start to increase it, look how far I can increase this before I start to see areas of clipped highlights. See, this area in red up here, these are all overexposed highlights. So you can actually push a file and exposure very far before you start to lose detail. I ended up photographing this image right here in this manner, but you can see that the histogram is definitely pushed over to the right. And this is going to give you that most importantly, more detail in the shadows and better colors and a less noisy photo. The most important thing to, I guess, understand with exposing to the right is that when you edit a photo that is exposed to the right, like this right here, I'm going to end up reducing the exposure. I'm sure you're thinking, like I did when I was, in the first many years of photography, every image I edited, the exposure slider was always increased. I always had to increase exposure on a photograph. Whenever you increase exposure on a photograph, you introduce more noise in that image. Whenever you reduce exposure of a photograph, you are not introducing any noise. It is always better to, when you edit a photo, to have to reduce exposure as opposed to increase exposure. So exposing to the right is definitely a good best practice to get into. So this right here, now I can see that detail. In the sky, I can start to see the detail everywhere else, but I ended up bringing this exposure down a full stop. And now you can see the histogram looks much, very much in the center, or indicative of a good exposure. And if I reset it, this is how it looked like in camera. So it was all kind of pushed to the right. Now, how do you do this? So what you want to pay attention to is you don't want the histogram pushed so far to the right to where it starts to get piled up, where it's pushed all the way to the right side, because that means you're overexposing your highlights. You want there to be a subtle gap between the edge of the histogram and your readings. So something like this right here. I'll end up zooming in here because it's kind of hard to see, but that right there, you can see that very subtle gap right there. That's where you want to stop. So you want to be able to make the image much brighter. The hard part of this is when you're looking at it on the back of your camera, it's going to look like this right here. And sometimes that is hard to say, okay, everything looks good, I can go ahead and leave. I used to be very nervous about doing this, and what I would do is I would take an image exposed to the right, and then I would take another image the way I normally would, which is usually underexposed. That way I had both, and plus it's a good exercise to just compare the two when you edit them. So definitely feel confident in doing this. Just make sure that you don't have that histogram pushed too far to the right, and I think you will be very, very pleased with the results. Not only will the exposure be correct, but you'll also have more flexibility in the digital darkroom, and you'll also be able to create much cleaner files. Now, before I do wrap everything up here, I just want to say a big thank you to the sponsor of this week's video, which is Squarespace, who I use for all of my website and e-commerce needs. Squarespace offers a stunning, user-friendly platform to build your website. With their Blueprint AI design system, you can showcase your photography and create a standout online presence with ease. Plus, built-in Squarespace SEO tools help your site appear in more searches, making it easier for the right customers to find you. And if you're looking to sell online, Squarespace's online store feature provides everything you need to sell your physical goods, digital content, or services seamlessly. So if you're looking to start a new website or possibly upgrade your current website, check out squarespace.com/Mark Denney for a free trial and 10% off your first purchase. So if you have any questions in regards to anything related to this video at all, or exposure compensation, light meters, histogram, or exposing to the right, please leave those in the comments section below, and I will do my best to get back in touch with you as soon as humanly possible. And if you did enjoy this week's video, if you could give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel if you're not subscribed already, and as always, I really do appreciate you carving out a little bit of time to spend it with me here today, and I will see you all next Wednesday. Bye.